Turkish troops cross the border into Syria. Ankara says it's to enforce a de-escalation zone deal. With so many foreign forces in the country, though, what does it all mean for the unity of Syria and the prospects of peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Dozens of Turkish soldiers have crossed into Idlib province in Syria as part of an agreement between Russia, Iran and Turkey to set up de-escalation zones. It's a move aimed at bringing peace to Syria. We'll get to our guests soon, but first this report from Hashim Ahlabarra from the border with Syria.
Turkey's cross-border operation is underway. These are soldiers from a special unit tasked with setting up surveillance posts in Idlib province. Turkey aims to enforce a ceasefire agreement that was signed last month in Astana. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the move was crucial for Turkey's national security.
Idlib is at our frontier. We have to take our precautions. No one has the right to tell us, why are you doing this? We are the country with the 911-kilometer border with Syria. We are the ones that are under harassment and threat. No one has the right to tell us, why did you do this?
Turkish soldiers are seen here in Qal'at Sam'an, a village on Aleppo's border with Idlib, not far from areas controlled by the YPG, a Syrian Kurdish faction. Turkey has repeatedly insisted it won't allow YPG fighters to expand further towards the northwestern provinces of Idlib and Latakia. This is a delicate operation for Turkey. Idlib is mostly controlled by Tharir al Sham, or HTS, a former al-qaeda affiliate. HTS rejects the de-escalation agreement, vowing to fight to the death. It's not yet clear if the group will be Turkey's next target.
Turkey's main concern was only these extremist peoples, but after changing the situation in Kirkuk and the referendum process, there are some consequences of the Kurdish movements in the, let's say, western border of the Syria to Turkey.
On Thursday, Egypt and opposition fighters reached a ceasefire agreement in eastern Ghouta, a rebel stronghold in the Syrian capital, Damascus. The deals would allow the rebels to get humanitarian aid in their besieged areas, but would also allow government troops to shift their focus to the east, where they are on the move against ISIL. The military campaign in Syria poses many challenges for Turkey. Ankara's stated goal is to ensure a ceasefire agreement holds in Idlib, but its real motive might be denying the Kurds access to areas like Idlib and the coastal province of Latakia. Hashim Ahlabarra, Al Jazeera, Jill Vigazu on Turkey's border with Syria.
So what was agreed on at the Astana talks in Kazakhstan then? Well, you may remember in September, Turkey, Russia and Iran all agreed to set up de-escalation zones in Syria for 6 months. The areas in mainly opposition-held parts of the country are eastern Ghouta, Idlib, Homs, Latakia, Aleppo and Hama. The zones are aimed at avoiding fighting between the different warring groups, the Syrian army and its allies on the one hand and the US-backed rebels. During the 6 rounds of diplomatic talks, the government delegation and armed opposition groups have traded barbs, staged walkouts and disagreed on proposed resolutions. Let's bring our panel into the show now. We have joining us here in the studio Marwan Kabalan. He's Director of Policy Analysis at the Doha Institute. From Istanbul, Metin Gurcan, a columnist at Al-Monitor's Turkey Pulse, and via Skype from Washington, D.C., Douglas Ollivant, Senior National Security Fellow at the New America think tank. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Metin, perhaps. How do you see this, Metin? Will the deployment of Turkish forces in Idlib cement the de-escalation deal?
First, I have to say this. I mean, this is not a surprising act, and this is not an unilateral act, Ankara's unilateral act. What we see is in a sort of negotiated outcome in accordance with the Astana talks. So yesterday night, those mechanized infantry units and some commando units crossed the border and deployed in the north of Idlib and into Idlib. So with this move, I would say that the first stage of the operation, which was the reconnaissance, observations and negotiations phase of the operation, particularly for the north of Idlib, is over. So the second stage is right now has just started. So what is Ankara's objective with this second stage is two objectives. First one is to create or establish a monitoring belt, I would say, monitoring belt, starting from Reyhanlı town of Turkey and stretching to the Mare region in the Euphrates Shield pocket. So in this 50 kilometers long zone, Ankara has been planning to establish 14 different observatory military outposts. For what? First one is to monitor the existing ceasefire, right, which is the open objective. And the second one is the isolation and containment of Afrin canton, which is currently under PKK-affiliated YPG forces.
Okay, let's bring Marwan here in the studio into the discussion. So Turkey's got a monitoring belt in place, says Metin. Does this mean the prospects of peace and a peaceful resolution are growing? Is it time to celebrate?
Well, I think it's a bit early for that, but let me remind our viewers that the fall of Aleppo was a turning point actually in this conflict, and because after that the whole process of Astana kicked off, and since then the whole dynamic of the Syrian conflict has shifted, has changed, and now
in favor of the regime
in favor of the regime on one hand, and also in the relationship between the three major powers, the three major players in the Syrian conflict, because we have seen Turkey, Iran and Russia supporting in a war by proxy, supporting different factions in this conflict. Turkey supported the Syrian opposition over the past 4 or 5 years, whereas Iran and Russia supported the Syrian regime. Today, we are seeing the three major players actually coming together, cooperating, trying actually to end this conflict. That, in my opinion, is a very positive development, because we say in Syria, when these different parties actually fight, the Syrians would pay the price actually, because they have been fighting for the past 4 or 5 years with Syrian blood.
This could lead to a bigger chance at a peaceful resolution?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so, but even if that does not lead to a political solution to this crisis, something that might be not very, we might not see very soon, at least that would end the bloodshed, that would end the conflict between the regime and the Syrian. And that might pave the way actually for further discussion concerning the political solution.
Douglas in Washington. It's interesting listening to Marwan there. He said the three major players. Where is the US? Is its influence waning?
I don't think it's so much the U.S.'s influence is waning as the U.S. does not have the security interests in Syria that the other three powers just mentioned do. The Iranians have an obvious ally in Syria, as do the Russians. It's one of the few real allies the Russians have. It's a major ally of the Iranians. And of course, the Turks have a border. The United States has none of those things. So it's not that the United States' influence is waning. It's simply that our interests aren't as intense.
The US does have allies in the form of groups which it's backing in the conflict.
We have groups that we're backing, but I think any observer would have to say our attempts have been somewhat half-hearted when it doesn't come to fighting ISIS. When it comes to fighting ISIS, we're very serious. When it comes to resolving the Syria conflict, less so. That's somebody else's problem.
Interesting, because I mean, this is exactly what the United States have been doing over the past couple of years. The main focus actually was ISIL. They did not really care about either actually changing the dynamic of the Syrian conflict or even finding a solution to this conflict. But that has led, on the other hand, to marginalizing the United States in this conflict. And in my opinion, it's not true that the Americans, they don't have security interests in Syria. Otherwise, why would they actually? Why are they supporting the Syrian Democratic Democratic Forces on one hand, and why they are investing so much heavily in the northeastern part of Syria. But as your guest from Washington said,
all right, let's give Douglas a chance to come back in on that.
The United States is a superpower. We have interests everywhere. The question is, what is the intensity of our interests? We do not have the intensity, for lack of a better word. We do not see Syria as critical to our interests as the Middle East as we do other places. Do we put some effort into Syria? Yes. Are we willing to pay a very high price to achieve a certain outcome in Syria? No, we're not.
All right. So,
but when the United States don't get directly involved in the Syrian conflict, and in the region, we have seen the rise of ISIL, which brought the United States once again to the region. So for me, it's a bit complicated issue because on one hand, the Americans don't have security interests in Syria. On the other hand, when ISIL actually gets strengthened, the Americans would bring all their forces actually back to the region and start this conflict.
Let's bring Metin in, since we're talking about the neighboring countries which do have a critical security interest and acknowledge that in Syria. Are we witnessing, Metin, though, something of the carving up of Syria into zones of foreign influence through this de-escalation deal?
I don't think so. I mean, here is the case. You know, the worst case or nightmare scenario for Idlib region is the Peshawarization of Idlib region, and it's becoming an Salafi jihadi hub that will threaten not only the future of Syria but also the future of the security of the region. So this is the first thing that we should we should prevent. The second issue, I think, in Ankara strategic thinking, you know, Ankara has an fear of being encircled or surrounded by an PKK or Kurdish belt stretching from Kandil region in northern Iraq via Sinjar region and via those two cantons in the east of Euphrates, Jazeera and Kobani cantons, and with this Afrin canton to the eastern Mediterranean. So Ankara is thinking that this should be the first threat to tackle. So I think this is the prime motive for shaping all outcomes right now in Ankara.
Okay, that's interesting. Marwan, do you think that Syrians see this as a move towards establishing peace in Syria, or more about containing the Syrian Kurds, which to Ankara appear to be some kind of threat?
That's very true. But on the one hand, if you ask about Syrians, it depends on which Syrian you are talking about, because if you are talking about loyalists, those who are supporting the regime, they have different answers to that. If you are talking to the opposition, and also within the opposition, there are different answers to that. But concerning Turkey and its interest in Idlib, in fact, I see this process, the whole process, having two main objectives for Turkey and the other parties to this agreement, the Iranians and the Russians. For Turkey, the main issue here is containing the Afrin, the Kurdish-dominated Afrin area in the northwestern part of the country. And by intervening militarily and directly in Idlib, they have in fact just surrounded the whole area which the Kurds are controlling in this part, and
they're trying to stop them from moving out and expanding and joining up.
And the Turks actually, they were very much concerned that the Americans will be supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces into a military operation into Idlib. This is why we have seen the Turks actually coming first, trying to prevent any probability that the Americans will be sending the Syrian Democratic Forces into Idlib and try to finish the rule of Tharir al Sham, the al-Nusra front. This is something that the Turks have actually stopped right now. But on the other hand, for the Turks and for the Russians and the Iranians, this is also an attempt in order to contain Tahrir al-Sham and Nusra. So we have the Turkish government trying to contain the Kurds. We have the Iranians and the Russians on the other hand trying actually to overthrow or to weaken al-Nusra front in this operation.
Douglas, what would it mean for Syria, for the region, for the world, if the Syrian Kurds are able to push out of their enclaves and create some kind of united territory?
Clearly, the Turks would not be fans of this, and it's hard to see the Turks allowing that to stand. And it's not clear to me that the Kurds could do that absent U.S. support. And I don't think that there will be U.S. support for Kurdish expansion. The U.S. is happy to support the Kurds in fighting ISIS. Once that's over, I suspect that support will significantly diminish.
Well, Turkey isn't the only country in the region right now which is very worried about the Kurds. Long-running tensions between Iraqi Kurdistan and the central government have escalated since last month's controversial referendum on Kurdish secession from Baghdad. Iran also has concerns about Kurdish empowerment. There are Iranian Kurdish groups on their side of the border with aspirations of independence too. Middle Eastern states do have that history of allying with each other's Kurdish rebels to undermine neighbouring governments. But now it appears central governments have a common fear of rising Kurdish power. Interesting development. Metin, do you think that policy towards Kurds is going to continue to drive divergence, perhaps, between Ankara in particular and Washington?
That's right. I mean, right now what we see in Iraq and in Syria is the, ISIS threat is more or less over. Post-ISIS setting, and then in this post-ISIS setting, the Kurdish people living in the host states of Syria and Iraq, they are, emerging as the most successful actor who can or who could expand its area of influence in territorial terms, and also who has big stakes and big expectations. So how to manage these expectations with the existing political context in the region. So that's why I think Ankara and Tehran, for instance, has been feeling this increased expectations as a direct threat for their, political beings. So that's why we see a sort of rapprochement between Ankara and Tehran at the moment because of this converging interest. So in the post-ISIS setting, the management of the increased aspirations and expectations of Kurds will be the prime factor shaping all outcomes.
All right, you made the point about rapprochement between Ankara and Tehran. Let's not also forget, Marwan, Baghdad is very much a player in the game of Kurdish power. Do you see these countries forming some kind of loose alliance, at least on the issue of how to confront rising Kurdish power?
I don't think we can talk here about an alliance. I can talk about convergence of interests, about the prevention of the establishment of a Kurdish state in the region. Because if we go back to Idlib and the Turkish operation in Idlib, while the Turkish government was actually trying to prevent a US-backed SDF forces from moving from Afrin southward towards Idlib to overthrow the rule of the Tharir al Sham and Nusra Front, the Turkish government, on the other hand, was trying actually to prevent both Iran and Russia from entering into Idlib and try actually to overthrow the Nusra Front. So we have the Turks actually trying to have twofold here objectives. On one hand, preventing the United States from entering the US-backed forces from entering Idlib, and on the other hand, preventing the Iranians and the Russians from doing exactly the same. So this is
that
why
may be a point of contention between Ankara and perhaps Washington and Moscow. But when it comes to, as you said, the convergence of interests between Tehran, Ankara and Baghdad.
Absolutely. They also agree on the prevention of the establishment of a Kurdish state. They are all actually in line concerning this issue.
Douglas, the US on the one hand supports Kurds in Syria, the YPG, which is the main component of the Syrian Democratic Forces, but the US has opposed the sort of independence push by Iraqi Kurds. How coherent, and is there a coherent US policy towards Kurds in the whole region?
I think so. I don't think the Kurds have clearly understood it. Washington sees itself as a friend of the Kurds throughout the region as sub-state actors. We are friendly with them. We have good relations with them. We're able to do a lot of things with and through them. That does not mean that we are supportive of their changing international boundaries unilaterally and declaring states. And Washington made that extraordinarily clear to Erbil. We flew principals in to send that message to Erbil and tell them quite clearly that we thought this was a monumentally bad idea and that there would be negative consequences, which could not be totally predicted, but would certainly be negative. And now that seems to be happening, and we're kind of in a I told you so moment with the Kurds. and they may have to live with the consequences of what they've done in Iraq.
This is very interesting statement, in my opinion, because for me, I mean, it means that the United States is using the Kurds as a proxy in the fight against ISIL. And once the fight against ISIL is finished, the Americans will most probably actually abandon the Kurds and leave them face, I mean, the major powers in the region who are actually trying to prevent them, because the Kurds actually were expecting to be rewarded by the United States, by the international community for their role in the fight against ISIL, by supporting their intention to declare an independent state. And now we are
seeing. So you think they're feeling let down?
I think so. I mean, this is what some of them actually have been expressing their frustration and disappointment at the position of both the United States and the European, the EU actually, concerning the referendum in the north of Iraq, which has taken place a couple of weeks ago.
Let me give Douglas a chance to come back in on that. Would you agree with that analysis?
I think that's right. I think the Kurds are disappointed, but I think the United States made it crystal clear what our expectations were and what the limitations of our support were. Quite frankly, the United States thought the Kurdish referendum was a bad idea, that it was not good for Kurdistan, and we thought we were being a good friend to the Kurds by telling them that. You know, your good friend is the one who tells you when you're about to make a mistake, not the one who encourages you to do it.
Metin, wherever this is heading and however much international support there is, if you look at some of the trends, I mean, the fight against ISIL in Iraq, for example, has left Iraqi Kurds in control of 40% more land and, as we know, stronger international backing, at least up until the referendum. The YPG, or the Syrian Kurds, have made similar achievements because of the fight against ISIL there in Syria. In June, in your country, in Turkey, the political party HDP received the highest percentage of votes from the Turkish in the Turkish Kurdish political history. Is any of this unstoppable? Maybe one thing to try and stop the Kurds from ascending further, but can any of this be reversed? I mean, doesn't there have to be at some point some different calculus on how to actually deal with the Kurdish question?
This is the $1 million word question at hand at the moment. The question is how to accommodate this, increased expectations in Syria and Iraq, in Kurdish expectations, and with the existing political system in the region, as I said before. And then let me say this. I mean, right now in the post-ISIS setting, what we need in Iraq and in Syria is an kind of calm, period, a sort of de-escalation, a sort of softening, and then also people's staying away from the armed conflict. So I think in this, to achieve or to get this end state, what we need is much more communication instead of, bullets and military operations, and much more dialogue. So the question is at hand is, how to integrate those, Kurds who felt themselves alienated in Iraq and in Syria, and then how to create a sort of new, refreshed center-periphery relationship in Iraq and in Syria. And all actors, regional actors, Turkey, Iran, and Syria and Iraq, and Baghdad and Damascus, they have to think about that. But more importantly, the system-level actors, right. Russia and the US, there should be a sort of top-down, conciliatory, top-down, comforting, relaxed approach. And that's why I think the cooperation or confrontation between the United States and Russia is the prime outcome. Prime factor determining all outcomes. So what we see, what we should see is
I'm afraid, Metin, I know we can talk about this.
A common vision. A common Kurdish vision of US and Russia.
End on. Let's hope for a common medium.
This is the thing we need
for everybody in this conflict. Let's thank our guests so much: Marwan Kabalan here in the studio, Metin Gurcan, and Douglas Ollivant. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.